As of July 3rd, we are currently training about 60 fighters. This number is much smaller than we'd hoped for at this point, partly because of the vetting standards.
President Obama took center stage at the Pentagon on Monday and delivered yet another rousing, inspiring, and impactful speech about the American efforts against ISIS and the dastardly Syrian dictator. This was, of course, the speech an alternate president delivered in an alternative universe, because in this one, he said very little of consequence, failing to reveal what was later learned that he was no doubt seeking to hide from the American people and our Middle Eastern allies. Those Syrian rebels we've been training to be the hard-edged ground force against Bashar al-Assad, thus far as successful as the administration's idea to create killer robots that look just like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Let's dig into the meat here with former intelligence officer, former advisor to General David Petraeus, and current director of the Global Initiative on Civil Society and Conflict, Colonel Derek Harvey. Well, Colonel, we had a very unremarkable speech from the president on Monday, and then here on Tuesday, earlier today, you saw another unremarkable effort, did you not?
That's correct. Unremarkable, a rehash, a restatement, staying the course. This is going to be a long campaign. I think Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, and General Dempsey, the chairman, were both playing defense most of the morning when they spoke up on Capitol Hill.
Do we not just have to get to the point that we must say to the president out loud, this is a failure. You will not be able to find enough people. They do not want to fight for us. And the sectarian nature of what goes on there simply will preclude anything like this happening, finding 3,500 fighters.
Well, I think, it's clear that the train and equip mission for both Syria and Iraq are failing, and the president's whole strategy seems to rely on finding those fighters to do the fighting on the ground. But they have not really resourced it, nor given the authorities that are required to really move that forward in an effective way. And I think it's mainly because of this, Ed. The president is really applying a counterterrorism plus strategy in both Syria and Iraq. They are trying to contain the problem and run out the clock. There's no real intent to achieve real results on the ground. Leadership is absent, and we're just looking to the next administration.
Colonel, as I said to some guests earlier, do we not have to finally realize that the Shiites don't like the Sunnis don't work with the Shiites don't work with the Kurds. This group is afraid of the Kurds coming in and being an occupying force. No matter how we try to divvy this up, we can't make them all join hands. We can't just put guns in their hand, and that's going to be a disaster at the end of the day if that's exactly what we do. How am I doing so far?
Well, that's not a bad description, because the extremes in most of the communities have taken the lead, and it's squeezing the moderates and the middle ground out. And the president's number one priority, according to the testimony today, is to influence Baghdad on the political lines of effort. Unfortunately, the president is not engaged in really achieving those results. We don't use our power and our authorities very well. We shirk from trying to really influence outcomes on the ground, and we convince ourselves that the reality is something different. It's a fantasy world that we're living in right now in the White House and in the execution of this strategy.
Let me deal with fantasy here a little bit. Senator John McCain, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was talking about the 3/4 of the air missions against ISIS return to base without dropping weapons. This, in his opinion, shows a fundamental problem with the coalition's air campaign. Here's his comments.
While our coalition may own the skies, as the president said yesterday, our air campaign against ISIL continues to be limited significantly by overly restrictive rules of engagement and a lack of ground intelligence, which only gets worse as ISIL moves into urban areas to avoid coalition bombing.
So if we take what he said, what you've learned, what we've talked about here, why doesn't somebody just say to the president, you failed, this isn't working? Because it would almost seem as if the American people are just being conveniently lied to once again by the executive-in-chief with regard to a war that we're fighting. My goodness, if I didn't know better, I'd swear it was 1960s Redux.
Well, I don't know what is going on in the internal discussions or what advice is or is not given by Secretary Carter or the chairman. What is clear, though, is that airstrikes would be much better if we had ground air controllers coordinating those strikes, and if we had direct action, U.S. Special Forces embedded with a number of these elements to facilitate the air campaign, but also to bolster the Iraqi security forces. But we're not going to go there, so no one's going to tell the king that this is what's really going on and this is what's needed, because the president, I believe, is clear that we're not going to get further engaged in Iraq or Syria.
It's terrible to say, but sometimes we find ourselves repeating ourselves. But it has to be said over and over again because the president continues to give us statements that simply have not a lot of fact and not a lot of meat for the American people to make them believe that we are trying to win this war. Colonel Derek Harvey, always a pleasure to have you on the show, my friend. Thanks so much. We'll talk again. All right, coming up next, the end of an American icon thanks to his admitted predilection with using drugs for dates. That and so much more when we continue right here on The Hard Line.